because we as believers, Christians, we need to be involved. So, Marty Probst, take the stage.
And I have to follow that? Marty, would you start with your name? Yes, I'm Marty Probst. I'm just an average citizen that's been an election judge in the city of Minneapolis since 2010. I don't live in Minneapolis. I just thought that was an opportunity, and in that process saw a number of things that were going on, and then started digging deeper and deeper into it. Didn't realize that every time I put another shovel in the ground to dig even further, it got worse, and it's much worse than I could ever imagine. I'm assuming just from I sent an outline to Alex, and I don't know if you guys ever shared my outline. I can do that outline, or I can just talk about caucuses and be an election judge and that sort of stuff. So,
either do the plan or something else.
the plan, no. I can take it either direction. I didn't.
What you guys talk about?
Okay. All right. Then I'll do that. I'll tell you what I found out. In Minnesota, we have we don't allow a number of things like voter ID. We're one of the few states that don't have voter ID. You have to vote. You have to have an ID to go visit the governor's mansion. You have to use it to vote in a union election. You have to use it for almost anything else. Buy a deer hunting license or fishing license or whatever, right? But you don't have it for elections. And there's all kinds of things out that, it's discriminatory, it blocks people from voting, all of that stuff. Well, all the facts are completely opposite of that. When voter ID is in the state, the numbers actually go up. So that's the direction ultimately we'd like to get to the point where it's voter ID. The idea is to have a fair election. We do not have a fair election. I'll run through some stats just as an example. In 2020, the Secretary of State, Steve Simon, won his third title in a row of highest voter turnout in the country, of 80%. Let me give you a comparison. Australia has mandatory voting. You get fined if you do not vote. I don't remember what the number is, but it's still something. Their voter turnout is in the low 80s. Wait a minute here, something's wrong, right? And coupled with that is watching the absentee ballot situation. Many of you heard of that, the absentee situation. Up until about 2015, absentee ballots came into the state or the county and then were distributed out to the precinct or the polling locations to be counted or opened, more importantly, and then counted with bipartisan oversight on Election Day until 2015. They changed that to stay back at the county, or if a city's big enough, like Minneapolis or St. Paul, those ballots stay there. Well, the state law says staff has to collect those. They cannot open absentee ballots. They can be open as of 5 o'clock 7 days before an election by bipartisan oversight. So Republican and a Democrat. And there actually is two other major parties now based upon the last election, and they're both marijuana-related parties. If they have people show up, they could also be part of that process, which is fine. So, but not in 2015, they kept that back at the county so that it doesn't go out, so that your neighbors, a polling location is typically your neighbors or people close by you. And so election judges ideally are local, so that you walk in and go, oh, I know you, Harry, or I know you, Mary, or whatever, and I can verify your address and so forth. Well, with absentee ballots now, they now stay at the city and the county, as I said, and in 2020, they weren't open in most precincts in the 5 major metropolitan areas in the Minnesota: Duluth, St. Cloud, Rochester, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. They're opened by staff. Well, in all of those 5 cities, most of the city council, most everybody else, are all Democrat related, or they're SEIE union members. They've been opening the ballots. They're not allowing the canvassing boards, which are supposed to be bipartisan oversight, to look at those ballots. So, what I discovered in 2018 was on top. So that's one issue with the absentee ballots. We want them to go back to the precinct level ultimately, and the state law says it. But Steve Simon has been working the election judge manual ever since he came in 7 years ago, and changing it subtly, but tells everybody, oh, it's the same manual all the way along. He has to get it approved by the legislature. Well, the legislature wouldn't approve his changes, because that's why they've got laws in place by the legislature. So absentee ballots have to be opened up to 7 days before by bipartisan oversight, and then you can't, the number of people you can vouch for, all of these rules. You get election day, how many days you get to vote, and all those sort of things. Those are all being changed by Steve Simon, and before that, Mark Ritchie. I'm jumping around a little bit, and I apologize here. Let me give you a little more backstory. Anybody remember the Bush-Gore presidential election? Some of you young kids probably wouldn't, but some of us old guys, we do. There was a perception that the Secretary of State in Florida swung the election. And because of that, a guy named George Soros and a couple of other groups associated with him decided, wait a minute, Secretary of State is a really important job. They get to count the ballots. And if you've ever heard the old adage attributed to Stalin, that it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. Okay? So he and a group of his folks funded 25 Secretary of State Democrats for that office. Nobody had ever put money into a Secretary of State office run. It was considered a clerk job. Secretary of State runs the corporate registrations. So if you start a little business and you want to incorporate that, you go down to the Secretary of State's office and you pay a fee and you get a name that's registered. The other thing they did was run an election every other year. It was a clerk job. There was a Joan Grove, some of us old folks know. She was in office for 20 years. Again, nobody put any money into it. Nobody cared. It was a clerk job. Until 2006, when that project was a 2006 Secretary of State project, and they funded those. They won 23 of those 25 offices. Soros ran around the country and bragged about how little money he'd put into it, the cheapest he'd ever spent on politics, with the most effect. 2 years after Mark Ritchie's elected in Minnesota, there was an election for Senate, or U.S. Senate, Norm Coleman and Al Franken. Within 2 weeks of the election, Norm Coleman clearly won that election after recount. Franken kept the vote open for 6 months. They collected more ballots. I have a guy in my Bible study group, and he said, about 3 years ago, there was a lawyer from a big firm in town, and he said she was laughing and bragging about how they swung that election. She said, we were told to find ballots, and we found them on Indian reservations. And that was what swung the election. Her husband was Franken's campaign manager. That's what swung that vote. But they also, at the time, there used to be, when you go in and you get your ballot, and you fill it out, and then you put it in the machine, it's called a tabulator. Well, back then, the tabulators were pre-stuffed. And what happens is that at the end of the night, when everything shut down, the election judges, we go and look at the tabulator. We count what the count is on the machine, And then we look at the signatures back then. How many signatures signed or voters had signed in? If those numbers aren't equal, the difference is usually there's more ballots in the tabulator. The state law said you're supposed to go in with bipartisan oversight, pull ballots out until that number equalizes. Well, the Democrats in 2008 said, no, we want all ballots counted. That was their excuse, even though it was against the law. It went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yes, we understand that's the law, but we've been doing this a long time like this, we're going to allow it. That's how Franken was seated. Okay? Well, since then, as election judge, we always check the tabulators to make sure those things are empty. And they are. That's how things started to change toward the absentee ballots. So this thing has been evolving. I've got all kinds of instances where to prove that, but we can't get the data. Steve Simon's got legal steps that he's got to turn over the data so that we can make sure that this thing's out. He refuses, but he's got the backing of the lower courts, which are appointed by his party's governor, and the Supreme Court, which is a 5-2 Democrat-Republican Supreme Court. And if you remember in 2020, elections are state sovereignty. They're not federal. H.R. 1, H.R. 4, Democrats are trying to get passed in the Congress that would take over elections, basically implement policies that Steve Simon and the Democrats have been imposing in Minnesota. Thankfully, it looks like it's dead because of 2 Democratic senators said, that's not fair. We need fair elections. Because what happens if we all feel that the election isn't fair? Which, by the way, 70% of the population from a number of polls said 2020 was not a fair election. We either don't vote or we stand up and say, this isn't acceptable. We're not going to take this anymore. So it's important for us to feel as citizen, as a republic, a participating citizen in a republic, to be involved, and we have the decision. If you remember from some of us that still had civic classes, we are sovereign. The citizens are sovereign. It's not the president, or that we don't have a king for a purpose. And we're not a majority. If people will say, oh, what about a democracy? Democracy is majority rule. We don't want majority rule, right? That's not, we want to help the little guy as well as big guy and be fair and all that. That's why our multiple levels of government and checks and balances and all that sort of stuff. So we need to get back to having control of that ballot box as citizens. That's why, as citizens, we can volunteer to be election judge.
Well, that's the point here. Everyone thoroughly upset? Do you want to change that? This is why Marty's here, is because we need honest, godly, God-fearing people to be
Election judges?
Tell them.
Election judges, as well as get on your canvassing boards. And the canvassing boards are at your, in this case, the city or the county that keeps that has the election or the absentee ballots. Like I said, as an election judge in Minneapolis, I was invited to be on the canvassing board in Minneapolis in 2020. About 2 weeks before that, they announced, oh, you're not going to be opening absentee ballots. I'm like, what? So again, they figured out a way to get around that. And so try and get on the canvassing board. It's up to 3 weeks of work because we have a longer voting season than most hunting or fishing seasons, right? We're the land of 10,000 close elections and lots of cheating opportunities for. So become an election judge on the canvassing board, but also on on election day, and watch what's going on. And I'm encouraging, whatever party you're involved with, be an election judge. You have to declare it as to what your party affiliation you are, and because we want bipartisan oversight. technically on election day in every precinct, there can't be more than one extra of any party. So if there's 9 election judges, there can be no more than 5 from either party and 4 from the other. Again, state law for a reason. We want fair elections. That's all we're all interested in. And if you're an election judge in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or around here, you will be paid. I think it's about $18.50 an hour. It's a long day. You're there at 6 a.m., and you're probably not out of there till at least 8:30, or in my case, I make sure everything is all put together, and then I follow the ballots to the distribution point where they're collected. I follow the head election judge, just to make sure they're there, because we've had instances where ballots just magically are put away until the next morning, and they show up. So we don't want that. Some people ask about poll challengers. Anybody heard of that? Don't do it. Why? Well, in Minnesota, that position has no power. They've watered it down to the point where you have to stand so far away from anything, you have no influence. It used to be you could look over the shoulders of election judges, as you should be able to as a poll challenger. Most states, you can still do that. Not in Minnesota. Besides, it doesn't pay. You have no power. Don't do it. That?
Appreciate it. You
Great.
can stick around here. You can talk to me a little bit longer there, so thanks for sticking around. But
Thank you.
if you, here you go. Come here. Yep, you too. Come here. If you were not here on Thursday, I want everyone to have one of these. It's a booklet on prayer. Hand out to everyone who hasn't got one. All right, so here, go ahead and pass that out. Take each side there. If you didn't get one, get one of these. I think it's a prayer, but God bless you guys. Encouraging you to be election judges. Get involved in that. Go to your caucus. Email me. There's some amendments that you can get, that you can present to whatever party you're at, for mandates and vaxes and things like that. But get involved. And then for those of you who go to the caucus, we'll meet at Sojourners Cafe afterwards, and bring a snack to share. If you didn't go to the caucus, don't come. But for those of you who went to your caucuses, come on and meet at Sojourners Cafe on Tuesday night, and we'll get together in prayer. But here's a booklet on prayer. I want everyone to have a booklet on prayer. And I'm looking for guys to pray with from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. on Wednesdays, or 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Wednesday nights at Sojourners Cafe with me. But God bless you guys.